name is Geoffery Morrell. I want to thank all those that are attending here in person today, and even those that will be viewing this by way of video. Now, on today, I will be discussing the topic of child abuse, and I've broken it down into three major categories. The first category we'll be talking about is sexual abuse, physical injury to children, and emotional mistreatment. Now, off to my right, you're going to see two young children, a young boy that's age 8 and a young girl that's age 10. It is children at these same various ages that are becoming victims of child abuse each and every day in this country and around the world. Thank you. Please have a seat. As I discuss child abuse today, just keep that in your mind, the innocence of a child that is becoming a victim of child abuse, and they have no power and no authority over what's happening to them. Now, to begin, under child abuse, my first topic is sexual abuse. Now, you'll see that I'm going to discuss this in great detail, but in the audience, you'll see that there's an older youth, an adult, 2 adults, and 2 children. That's because it's very important for both adults, children, and the older youth to be educated and have an awareness as to what child abuse is and its various forms. Now, again, the first topic that we'll be talking about is sexual abuse. Most people think through movies and what they see on TV that the most common form of sexual abuse is from a stranger and getting kidnapped or thrown into a trunk or tied up or whatever the imagination may lead you to believe. But in reality, studies have found that the most common form and the most existent form of child sexual abuse exists through incest. Now, what is incest? Incest is when someone too closely related to a child commits sexual abuse to that child. That could be a father, it could be a mother, it could be a doctor, it could be the close family friend, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, you name it. If they're closely related to the child, that person has the capability of committing incest to a child. But statistics are proving it that it's happening every day. Children that are safely and securely in their home are being abused by those that love them the most. So, I looked up a dissertation that was written by Phyllis Graham Dickerson. His dissertation was titled, "The Role of Disclosure in Incest Survival, Resurrection of the Buried Self." What was the purpose of this article? Well, it helped us to define incest. The author agreed that incest was defined as a person too closely related to the child, committing a sexual abuse to the child. But it also gave statistics that find that 1 in every 4 females, specifically saying, is sexually abused by the time she reaches the age of 18. Now again, we're not talking about a stranger, we're talking about someone that is safely and securely in their home. And so sexual abuse is indeed a problem when it comes to existing inside of a home. It's kept secret. People don't like to talk about it. Children don't like to talk about it until they're much older, and even then it's very painful to talk about. Now, the next topic I want to talk about is sexual abuse in the foster care system. Now, when sexual abuse happens, many people wonder, what's the intervention? How do we protect children from sexual abuse? Well, they go through the judicial system, and the judicial system will then put that child in a foster care system. But the problem is that even in foster care, children that have a history of being sexually abused have the likelihood of being abused again in the foster care system with that caregiver, that foster parent. And so statistics show through a dissertation written by Patricia Hartman, her dissertation was titled "The Effects of Foster Care Residents and Age of Child on Credibility of Child Sexual Abuse Allegations," and another dissertation was written by Sylvia Cortez titled "Therapeutic Support Groups for Children in Foster Care Who Are Victims of Sexual Abuse, a Grant Proposal." So these are 2 different dissertations written by 2 different authors that are going to support this view that children are abused, sexually abused, in foster care. The first point I'd like to bring about is that in the first dissertation, it helped to prove that the intervention method for children who are sexually abused is to place them in foster care. This author put a lot of detailed information into her article showing that when these kids are abused and when they are neglected, that it is the judicial system's job to put them into foster care. So it's supported that you can find information and statistics on that. Now, the second dissertation that I read to you, it revealed how children in foster care are actually reporting sexual abuse allegations to the proper authorities and officials, but they're not being believed about it. Most people think when a child in foster care is reporting sexual abuse that they're just making it up because of their emotion or they're angry or they're sad. And that may be true in some circumstances, But statistics have found that when these reports and certain studies, when they were investigated, that these reports are coming back being substantiated. That is to say, they're coming back as true. And so we cannot ignore the fact that children are sexually abused in their home. We cannot ignore the fact that once they're in a safe house, such as foster care, that they're still being abused. And so that takes me to my next point, and that is that sexual abuse also exists through child sex trafficking. Now this is where you can use, with the illustration that I'm going to present you in your mind, how strangers are committing sexual acts against children, and that is through child sex trafficking. And so child sex trafficking can be basically understood by prostituting a child and doing it and having sex with a child for a profit. Now, a dissertation written by Joan Reed titled A Pathway to Child Sex Trafficking and Prostitution, the Impact of Strain and Risk Inflating Responses. The point of this dissertation, it points out that child sex trafficking is a contemporary manifestation of slavery whose victims are predominantly women and children. And that makes sense. When you think about these innocent children that are passed along this hidden chain of sexual abuse that people, you can't always find out where it's taking place at, where they have been held captive at, who's going to get kidnapped next. This is child sex trafficking. These children are being abused, and they're being abused for profit by people all across the nation and all across the world who are paying to actually sexually abuse a child. Now, the second point of this dissertation is that it helps to describe a form of sex trafficking, and it can be described as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through use of force, fraud, or coercion, help me Lord, for the purpose of subjecting that person to involuntary servitude, debt, bondage, or slavery. So we see that there are various forms that exist in child sex trafficking. And through these different methods and forms, a child is becoming a victim of child sex trafficking. Now, children aren't just sexually abused. Child abuse exists in other forms as well, such as physical injury. What is the problem with physical injury? Well, it's debated, should children be spanked? Should they be whipped? What constitutes if a spanking is child abuse or just discipline? And so that brings about my first point under physical injury is corporal punishment. A dissertation written by Stephanie Whitus Walsh, and it's titled The Relationship of Victims' Perceptions of Child Physical Abuse and Adult-Formed Attitudes Toward Physical Forms of Discipline and Perpetrators of Child Physical Abuse. Now, the first major point that this author brings up in her dissertation is the debate that's ongoing about spanking children. And so you'll have a group of folks that support spanking children, you have a group of folks that's against it. And the ones that are for it say we spank children because it's to discipline them for bad behavior. And the other side says, well, when you're spanking a child, you're abusing them. And there's other methods to disciplining a child than spanking them. Now, also in this dissertation, the author points out that it can be easily determined if child abuse is occurring from physical form of discipline by such as recognizing if the parent is punching a child, kicking a child, using some type of hard or some type of object, some type of hard or different object that's not the belt, and using that to intentionally harm a child, leaving bruises or making the child to bleed. This can be considered physical abuse compared to just corporal punishment. Now, if a parent is intentionally bringing harm to the child, then that parent is indeed a child abuser. Now, my next point is that child abuse doesn't only exist through physical injury, but also through homes that have a prevalence of domestic violence. Parents that are always fighting and physically having contact with one another, they don't always realize that the kids are watching and that the kids are witnessing this taking place in their home. And domestic violence has a huge impact on a child's life. Now, the Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence website, this website provides information online that gives great detail as to how domestic violence can be considered child abuse to young children. It points out that the dynamics of domestic violence are unhealthy for children. Such dynamics would include control of family by one dominant member, abuse of a parent, isolation, and or protecting the family secret. When domestic violence is occurring in a home and these factors are included, then you know that the child is in an unhealthy situation. And by putting a child in an unhealthy situation, this constitutes as child abuse. Now, furthermore, when parents or caregivers use drugs or alcohol, then that is also considered a gateway to child abuse. And so a dissertation written by Shelley Schultz, which is titled Child Physical Abuse, Relationship of Parental Substance Use to Severity of Abuse and Risk for Future Abuse. This dissertation talked about how drug use and alcohol use both are linked to aggressive behavior. Well, why is that important? This aggressive behavior has to fall on somebody. Now we know form number one is aggressive behavior can fall on both the parents, and that's domestic violence. But what happens when it physically falls onto the child? All of that aggression that the drug use has formed and all that aggression that the alcohol use has formed. Well, now you're abusing the child physically and emotionally. The child becomes the victim of this aggressive behavior, and oftentimes they can be injured, badly, harmed, or just in danger. Now, also, when these things are manifesting, now we have to take into consideration the emotional mistreatment of children. Children are innocent. They don't have any control over any of the stuff that is taking place, and when they don't have control over it, it's the parent or caregiver's job to make sure that they're doing the best that they can to protect the children in their household. So what happens then when a parent is verbally assaulting a child? That causes emotional mistreatment to a child, which is child abuse. Verbal assault, we can look at the dissertation written by Richard Lang. It was titled Verbal Abuse by Parents Who Maltreat or are at Risk for Maltreatment of Children, Predictors and Intervention. So the first point about this dissertation is that it found through a study that data on effects of verbal abuse on children indicate that children exposed to parental verbal abuse develop internalized problems such as low self-esteem, negative worldviews, and poor self-image. The second point I'd like to make is that verbal abuse will cause children to develop bad behaviors such as being non-compliant, being aggressive towards their parents, and displaying behavioral problems. So when parents are verbally assaulting their child, such as calling them unnecessary names, always yelling at them, speaking to them in a way that's very demeaning or degrading to them, it does affect the child. And that's going to be a form of child abuse. Now, the next topic I want to talk about under emotional mistreatment is child emotional neglect. This can be supported by the dissertation written by Chipke O'Keefe, and it's titled Dimensions of Child Abuse and Neglect, the Relationship to Academic Achievement. The first point I'd like to make under this dissertation is that this dissertation points out the acts by caregivers that can result in emotional abuse, which such acts may include engaging in chronic or extreme spousal abuse in a child's presence, allowing a child to use drugs or alcohol, refusing or failing to provide needed psychological care, constantly belittling the child, and withholding affection. Each of these things, children need to be loved, they need to be cared for. And if a parent or caregiver falls under one of these actions, then they're emotionally neglecting the child. Furthermore, exploiting or corrupting a child. An online source titled Child Abuse Effects. This online source informs that emotional abuse may be considered rejecting, isolating, ignoring, corrupting, exploiting, or terrorizing a child. Corrupting a child may include encouraging a child to do things that are illegal or harmful to themselves, such as rewarding for bullying or teaching racism to the child. Exploiting the child, this may consist of giving a child responsibilities that are far greater than a child that age can handle, or using a child for profit. So when exploiting a child, this can be considered, when corrupting a child, this can be considered rewarding them for bullying or teaching them racism, as I said previously. And so, the parents shouldn't reward their children for doing the wrong things in society. They should be teaching them to fit into society. And by teaching them to fit into society, they're helping them to grow emotionally and healthy lifestyles. Now, exploiting a child, examples may include infants, parents who expect their infants never to cry, or sexually abusing a child. Those are two examples under exploiting a child that can cause them emotional mistreatment that can even carry into their adulthood. So in conclusion, what did we learn today? That child abuse exists in more than just one form. Child abuse exists when they're sexually abused, when they're physically injured, and when they're emotionally mistreated. Under sexual abuse, we learned about incest. That's the #1 form. We learned about sexual abuse that occurs in foster care, and we learned about child sex trafficking. Under physical injury, we learned about the debate and the disagreement between corporal punishment. We learned about how children are abused by way of excessive force being used to them. And under emotional mistreatment, we talked about how they can be neglected or isolated or terrorized. And each of these factors and more can contribute to child abuse. I want to thank each of you for joining me today and hearing this debate, hearing this discussion. I want to thank those that viewed the video as we did this today. Thank you for your time.